Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AKA Hotel Residences Corman Communities, Ariel Property Advisors, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Mortgage Lending, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Casamatides Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Ocean First Bank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, Stonehenge NYC, SVN CPEX Real Estate Services, Tierra CRG, the Meringer Family Foundation, and these friends. Today, I'm fortunate to have a real estate leader and a philanthropist, John Usdan, who's the CEO of Midwood Investment and Development. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
John, so let's go back and let's talk about your grandfather.
He was the most humble, self-effacing, down-to-earth, brilliant person I've ever known.
He was an entrepreneur, right? He started working when he was, I believe, 12 years of age in one of the articles I read. And he was always creative. And talk to me about the time that he was selling houses and made more money in 3 days than he made in the past 9 months.
Well, that's where the origin of Midwood came from, because in the 1920s, and I believe it was 1925, he got a job selling houses, and he sold 3 houses in the first weekend, and he made $600, which he told me was more money than he had made in the previous 6 months. And my response to him was, "Grandpa, how did you do that?" And he said, "I always told my customers the negative aspects of what they were looking at, because I felt that if I told them about all of the bad things and they were still interested, that they were a real buyer." And he also wanted to gain their trust, and he felt that telling them about all the good things would not accomplish that.
During the Depression, he had certain partners, the legendary Eisner and Lubin, who created an accounting firm over there. They were able to take over mortgages because there were syndications and debt, correct?
That's correct. The way real estate was financed during the 20s was through private syndications. So it was the first securitization of debt that occurred. The banking system was not as well developed. You could only go to a few major banks to borrow money. And so to create liquidity in the market, they created these securities, which when the Depression came about and people couldn't pay their rents, the value of the securities absolutely crashed to pennies on the dollar. And they recognized that there was a real opportunity So Joe Eisner, Joe Lubin, and my grandfather had a company called Granite International Corp, and they went about purchasing these debt securities and ended up controlling 10,000 apartments by the time the Depression was over.
And a significant number of these apartments were in Brooklyn, I believe.
Yes, yes. They own 15 buildings, for example, on Ocean Parkway.
At an early age, he decided to give back, to become a philanthropist, and gave back most of his properties to fund the Lemberg Foundation, which I think was founded in 1945.
It was, and he had a very difficult time when he first came to this country because he traveled. He had two sisters and two brothers. They left Russia or Kishinev because his oldest brother was to be conscripted into the Russian army and sent to the front in the war with Japan. And though that war was particularly brutal, because what the Russians would do is they would have the Jews be in the first charge against the Japanese. And so the mortality rate was nearly 100%. And while the Japanese were reloading their guns, then the Russian soldiers would fire. So they fled Russia so that his older brother wouldn't be conscripted. And he unfortunately died in passage of tuberculosis. A year after they arrived in the United States, his mother died of stomach cancer. And so he had a very difficult passage. They had no money, and he wasn't able to go to school.
So he accumulated properties in after the Depression, mostly in New York, right?
Mostly New York, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Florida.
Tell me about your mother, his daughter.
So my mom was an only child. My grandfather and grandmother had another daughter who died at the age of a year and a half of pneumonia. And so she grew up as an only child in Crown Heights, and she had a wonderful childhood. My grandfather, by the 30s, had become successful. He had a box at Ebbets Field. She would go to the baseball games after school. She knew all the Brooklyn Dodger players by first name because their box was right above the dugout. And she went to the Center Academy, which was a very progressive Jewish day school. Her first art teacher was an artist by the name of Mark Rothkowitz. And my mom was very creative. She was a writer and very bright. She was the second smartest person I've known.
Tell me about your dad.
My dad was the son of a Russian immigrant. My grandfather, David, came over in 1917 from Grozny, which was at the time, part of the Ukraine. Today would be part of Poland, but they were Russian speaking. And they went into the paper converting and distribution business. And so my dad grew up in Lawrence, Long Island. And after school went to work for his father along with his brother.
How'd your parents meet?
On a blind date.
The family was very close and you lived very close to each other within a 9-block radius, correct?
Yes. Well, my grandparents lived on 68th Street and we grew up on 77th Street. That was after my grandfather decided to move when my mom was 19 in 1949 to Manhattan. And my grandmother's admonition was, Sam, in Brooklyn, you're a big fish in a small pond. If you move to Manhattan, you'll be a small fish in a big pond. But he moved anyway.
Okay, so let's talk about you. You were born when? I know it was Mount Sinai Hospital.
In 1958.
Okay, so talk to me about growing up in Manhattan and also the involvement that your grandfather had on your life.
You know, I went to the 92nd Street Y nursery school and then went to ethical culture. And I have vivid memories of taking the bus to school. My father first drove us. And then when I was about 9 or 10, we would take the New York bus to school on the way home. And New York was a much different place. There was in 1968, for example, one day, my mom was a smoker, which was turned out to be a very unfortunate thing. But in 1968, my mom sent me to Kay's Luncheonette, which was on the corner of 78th and Lexington, to buy cigarettes. And Kay ran the luncheonette and knew my mom, knew my brother, sister, and I, and knew that my mom would send us to buy cigarettes because even then it wasn't kosher to sell a carton of cigarettes to a 10-year-old kid. So one day she said, I need a carton of cigarettes. And so a carton of cigarettes cost $5.25. And my mom smoked Kent Lights. And that day, Kay didn't have the carton of cigarettes. So on my way home between Lexington and Park on 77th Street, we live between Park and Madison. I get tapped on the shoulder and I'm asked if I have any money for the subway. And I turn around and it's a young guy who is pretty tall, and I just kept walking. And the next thing I know, I get slapped in the back of the head and he said, I'm talking to you, I need money for the subway. So I reached into my pocket and I gave him the quarter and kept the $5. I went home, told the story to my mom and said, I'm never buying you cigarettes again. So, and I never did. But New York was a much different place in the 1960s and early 70s. And it wasn't until Koch became mayor that you started to see noticeable improvement in the quality of life.
So after high school, you had an opportunity, you decided to go to Wesleyan. How did you decide to go to Wesleyan?
I got in. I was, my interests were writing and design and architecture and art. And Wesleyan had a terrific English department and a terrific art history department. It was a very progressive, wonderful school, and it still is. At Wesleyan, I was able to really pursue all of my different interests. I always tell people that it was the place where I learned how to think.
Now, when you were going to college, did you realize that you were destined to get into the real estate business, even though Grandpa had sold significant portion of the holdings of the company?
Yes, I had started working for my grandfather when I was about 10, or should I say, I started getting paid by my grandfather when I was about 10. And all through school, through high school, even in high school, I would arrange my schedule so that I would have at least one afternoon a week to come to his office and work with him. Every Sunday throughout college, I had a standing call with him for an hour where we would catch up on what was going on in the office. At that time, he had taken this very large portfolio and reduced it to one operating property, about 30 odd other net leases. So he had really simplified his business because he said to me that he did not want his responsibilities to become my burdens. And he wanted to leave his affairs, his business, with the least amount of responsibility to his family, which was, I didn't realize it at the time, but as you get older, you understand how wise a judgment that was.
So now you graduate and you don't start working full-time for the company. You have some opportunities with the legendary Norman Levy, correct?
My grandfather was very good friends with Norman Levy, and I had an opportunity to go work for Norman. Norman would have done anything for my grandfather, but I turned Norman down, much to my grandfather's chagrin, because I said, Grandpa, I don't want to manage buildings. I want to learn how to invest. I want to learn how to buy buildings. And there was a wonderful guy by the name of William Felton, who had just developed the old Abercrombie and Fitch department store on 44th and Madison into an office building. And he had a investment and syndication business. And I was fortunate to be able to get a job working for him as an analyst.
But you
my grandfather also said to me, you can't work for me. You have to get experience someplace else.
Right. But then your grandfather came down. He was sick, correct?
No, he had suffered a heart attack in 1963. This was now 1980, and he just wasn't doing well. And one day I went to work for Bill Felton in September, and one day in March, my grandfather called me up and he said, I want to talk to you. And I came to see him, and he said, it's time for me to retire. I'm not doing well, and you need to come to work full time and run the business. And I did that for 3 months. And then in July of 1981, my grandfather passed away.
So let's talk about the business then and the business today, because it was a small captive company, as you said, with a lot of leaseholds and one property holding. Midwood today has over 140 properties in many states and large retail holdings, offices, and other type of properties.
I always felt that I was extraordinarily fortunate. I had this wonderful legacy. The only responsibility that my grandfather had really left was his philanthropic interests. The foundation was started in 1945 in response to the Holocaust and how to aid the children of the displaced peoples. So my grandfather established the Lemberg Foundation and the Lemberg Scholarship Loan Fund, which both exist today, and my sister, brother, and I manage. And so I had this wonderful legacy, and I had a grandfather that I adored. And I really felt that if I didn't do better than he did, that given the head start I had, I would not consider myself to be successful. So within 6 months after his death, I started buying walk-ups in Hell's Kitchen. And I had done an analysis of the city in 1980 and 81 and started walking different neighborhoods, and had come to the conclusion that the office development that was taking place in the late 70s on 6th Avenue would continue moving west, and that all of those businesses would hire people that would need a affordable housing within walking distance. And I felt that the neighborhoods to the west of 6th Avenue would benefit. And I really liked Hell's Kitchen. It had, I always thought of Hell's Kitchen, particularly in the 40s and 50s, as the breadbasket of New York. It had great bakeries and produce purveyors and butchers and pasta makers, and was very vibrant. And you could tell that the neighborhood was changing. So within 2 years, I bought about 25 properties in on 9th, in and around 9th Avenue between 47th and 56th Street. In the late 80s and with the onset of the recession in the early 90s, I felt that the migration to the suburbs was abating, that the opportunities in the suburbs were limited, and that particularly in the shopping center business or industrial business at that time, there was an oversupply. And I could see that in the recession of the early 90s that our properties in the city performed far better than our properties in the suburbs. And because I was always interested in the development business, I was looking for ways to accumulate development rights and make a return so that if I ever acquired the organization or the expertise to develop them, I wouldn't be under any pressure and I would have the right basis. So I started investing in New York and Philadelphia and Boston principally in the early to mid 90s, and then eventually expanded. We have some holdings in Washington, D.C. and now in Los Angeles.
And you have today an apartment house being built on 78th Street and Lexington Avenue, correct?
Yes, at the site of Kay's Luncheonette.
That's interesting. Kay's Luncheonette comes back again.
Yes, and the name of the LLC is Kaylee, for K on Lex.
So let's talk about your wife and your sons. I think we have a couple more Wesleyan graduates also.
I have 3 boys. My oldest son, Sam, is 27 and is in his 2nd year at Kellogg, getting his MBA, and I have identical twins, Simon and Joshua, who are working in the city.
And let's talk today about you're involved with the Brooklyn Academy of Music.
Well, before that, and I'd just like to say that I recently celebrated my 32nd anniversary, and I'm very fortunate to be married to my wife. I don't know how fortunate she is, but I feel fortunate.
Congratulations. With regard to philanthropy, what's the major interest that you have?
There are a number. I'm very involved at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Usdan Center for the Creative and Performing Arts, and the Hastings Center for Bioethical Research, amongst others.
And there's also a heavy involvement with Brandeis University, correct?
And my brother and I were involved with the founding of the business school. I was chair of the business school board. So, and my grandfather was a longtime member of the Brandeis board and was treasurer of the board.
So, you know, what's great is that you and your family is following the tradition of your late grandfather. And
my mom, Michael.
No question. I read about your mom, okay? There's no question about that. And I'd like to thank you for being here today and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.